Today we are joined by Anthony Grooms, author of Birmingham, Trouble No More, and his latest novel, The Vain Conversation. My first question for you, Anthony, is what is your earliest memory of writing and literature?
Thank you, Mustafa, for inviting me to be on this program. My earliest memory of writing goes back pretty far to when I was probably 4 or 5. My mother taught me to write and read early, and she early for those days. I know that there are kids today who learn that, but in those days, when I was young, children typically didn't learn reading and writing before first grade. So then, I remember at age 14, actually, attempting my first novel. I got to about 14 pages in it, and then had to let it go. But I've always been writing in high school and elementary school. Never thought of it as a profession, but always did it.
What kind of authors and books were you gravitating towards in those formative years that helped shape your own craft?
Primarily books for boys, Hardy Boys, mysteries, for example. Also, lots of fairy tales. We had a golden encyclopedia of folk tales and fairy tales. I did a lot of reading about science. I was kind of a science nerd. So also there was something called the Golden Encyclopedia of Science or Nature or something of that, something like that. And also a lot of science fiction. So popular things by and large. And as I got into my teen years, that began to read more literary science fiction and then literature.
When it comes to writing and actively releasing writing, was this the first instance in your family, being the first person to pursue writing in your family?
In my immediate family, yes. That is to say, within my branch of the family, certainly among my siblings, I'm the only writer or professional writer. They're all smart people, but they do different things. Scientists, and my sister works for a publishing company, but not as a writer. Within the larger family, though, the extended family, there were at least a few distant cousins who were writers. Intazaki Shangay, for example, is a distant cousin. She's a playwright for colored girls who have considered suicide, etc. Longish title. So there were, though I would say that she was not a model because in my youngest days I had no connection with her, and quite frankly I still don't have much of a connection with her. But by the time I was in college, I did know of her and my connection to her.
What was the fondest memory of a single class or a single instance during your MFA program at George Mason that still resonates with you today?
There are really a number. I think the one thing that is a kind of turning point for me in that whole graduate experience was right at the beginning of the experience. I'd already taken some community college courses with Richard Bausch, who still is my mentor. I admire him greatly. Richard, we were standing in the middle of what was called the Lums. It was a hamburger and beer joint around Alexandria, Virginia. And he came to me and invited me into the graduate program at George Mason. And I stood there a little bit dumbfounded that he would think that I was graduate school material. And I looked at him and said, "Who, me?" And he looked at me in a similar kind of dumbfounded way and said, "But you're a writer." And I remember rushing home after that incident to my then girlfriend and rushing in and saying, "Dick says I'm a writer. Dick says I'm a writer." So that's one moment, and it's an interesting moment because it was a confirmation from a writer I admired, telling me that I was also a writer. It was kind of an existential moment for me, and from that moment forward, I began to think of myself as one of my friends put it. Well, at that point, really unpublishable, but eventually my friend would put it as moving from being unpublishable to merely unpublished. So, but thinking of myself as a writer then. Graduate school was a really great experience for me because of the mentorship with Bausch and other teachers there, and because I was doing at last what I had found to be my passion.
Was there something that you had to overcome during your MFA experience, writing-wise? Are you a believer in writer's block, for example?
I'm not so much a believer in writer's block. I know it happens. Typically it happens when people are just tired or they're forcing themselves to write on a project that they've lost interest in. That's never been a particularly big problem with me. I've always seemed to have had something to write about. Having the time to write about it, that's actually been more of a problem after graduate school than during graduate school. So writer's block has not been a terrifically big problem for me. My big challenge back in the 1980s was that the economy was terrible. I was putting myself through graduate school, and I had to find jobs. And I worked at so-called part-time jobs that were really 40 hours a week, though I got no benefits for a full-time job. And then there were stretches in which there just weren't jobs. So I had to drop out of school in order to just put peanut butter and crackers on the table.
Teaching in a city like Athens that is so culturally rich still, with so many acts in not only literature but music and film, and it's just a bustling college town that has such a strong local community. How did that impact your creative writing in Athens at that time?
I spent 5 years in Athens as a creative writing teacher. And certainly I did enjoy the really bustling college scene that was going on then. It was the time of the rise in popularity of REM, for example. But I didn't live in Athens. I lived in Atlanta and was commuting back and forth, so I always felt that Atlanta was my home. And Atlanta, I think, is an even more culturally rich place. Maybe not so much in music as Athens was then, in popular music, but in terms of the writers that I communed with, in terms of theater, for example, I found that Atlanta was and still is a very, very rich place.
Your most recent novel, The Vain Conversation, had a very warm welcome earlier this year in Atlanta. And did this inspiration for this novel, did it begin in Atlanta? And did the writing of the novel occur primarily in Atlanta or elsewhere?
Primarily right here in Atlanta, at this house. The inspiration came now some 27 years ago. It's hard to believe that much time has passed, but reading the Atlanta Journal and Constitution, I read about a man who had witnessed the lynching in 1946 or 7, I forget now, but just after World War II, and had to live with that having a kind of witness without a voice, and was really terrified and said essentially that having witnessed that murder, or those murders, because it was a multiple lynching, he had been just thrown off course. He just didn't feel he'd been as successful in life as he wanted to be. And that was what attracted me to the story of Lamour's Landing lynching, not so much the victims, because let's face it, it's an unfortunate part of American life that many, many, many people were lynched. There are many stories of lynching from the perspective of victims. But I wanted to explore this lynching from the perspective of an innocent who had witnessed the lynching. And eventually, the novel also explores from a possible perpetrator and a victim as well. So there are three predominating perspectives in the story. I wrote it primarily just here. I have an office in the basement, and early on when we moved into this house some 25 years ago or so, we had an office upstairs. So here's where I wrote the novel.
What are your thoughts on Atlanta's literary scene?
I think it's a wonderful literary scene. I always make this distinction between scene and community. And a scene is, where people dress up with black shirts and go out and smoke cigarettes and put on poses of various kinds and sleep with each other's spouses, maybe. But a community is where people support one another's writing. You go to as many readings as you can. You make a hoop to do when one of your friends publishes a book. That's a community, and I'm not much for the scene, but I know that there is a very strong community here. When I first moved to Atlanta some 33 years ago, I did not. I practically knew everybody in the community. It was a very small community, and now it's just multiplied in a way that I can't say that I know even most of the people who are writing and publishing in Atlanta today. But I've always felt very much supported by the Atlanta writers that I know.
Is there anything you are working on currently that we can expect in the future?
Well, I have two manuscripts that are circulating right now. One is a novel set in Sweden during the time of the Vietnam War, following American deserters from the war. One is a middle grade novel set in Birmingham during the Birmingham movement, an introduction maybe to the Birmingham movement through fiction for young readers. I'm working on a novel, and all I can really say about it is that the initial setting, at least, is on the moon. It's a science fiction novel, so in some ways I'm going back to my very earliest interest. But that's coming in bits and pieces. I have an essay coming out a little later this year from UGA Press, actually. It's a part of a collection of memorial essays for Pat Conroy, the writer who died a couple of years ago.
What is the one thing that keeps you returning to the novel as a form of writing?
The one thing probably is just stupidity. Because when you really think about it logically, why would you sit down and tackle a long work of art that you might or might not finish, and it might take you 20 years. Many people can do it in a couple of years, but others of us, we know we go for a long time. But It is it's a pleasure in that it's intellectually engaging. It's an indulgence in that I get to spend time with my own thoughts and ideas, and I get to explore, to research, and to imagine, at least for a couple of hours a day. So I think that ultimately it is driven by my need to have this artistic, intellectual stimulation, and by the need to and want to say something about the subjects that interest me.
Anthony, this has been anything but a vain conversation with you. I thank you for your time, and I wish you all the best in your future endeavors.
And I thank you. And I thank you.
All right, I'll recover these. Thank you. All right.